Gentlemen, please welcome Dean David Ellwood. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ellwood, and I'm the Dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's my very great honor to welcome the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. Welcome, sir. I want to offer my special thanks to the Institute of Politics and the Office of President Faust for all the hard work. Now, it seemed inconceivable that Joe Biden Jr. would win his first Senate campaign. He was just 29 years old and had served for 2 years in the Newcastle County Council. He was the only Democrat willing to run against longtime incumbent Republican J. Caleb Boggs. As of the summer of 1972, just a few months before the election, he trailed by 30 points. His campaign manager was his younger sister, Valerie, and no one was providing much money. But on November 7th that year, he won. 2 weeks later, he turned 30. Good thing, too, because the minimum age for serving in the Senate is 30 years old. What kind of man has the platform, the guts, the confidence that it takes to mount that sort of upset at 29? He campaigned house to house, block to block. He talked about getting out of Vietnam, civil rights, the environment, more equitable taxation, health care. By the way, do any of those themes sound familiar to you? People obviously saw someone they thought they could trust, someone who understood, and not much has changed since that time. Many of you know that roughly 3 weeks after he turned 30 and before he entered the Senate, Joe's wife and family were involved in a terrible automobile accident while Christmas shopping. He lost his wife and one-year-old daughter. His 2 sons were badly injured. Now, the pain and loss of that might have broken Mr. Biden, yet we all know he became one of the most influential and powerful vice presidents in the history of this republic. Eventually, he also found love again and has been married to his wife, Jill, longtime educator for over 35 years. But those who knew him best were not surprised. Biden has exercised leadership in the face of adversity from a very young age. Now, we're very fortunate here at Harvard to have Valerie Biden Owens, an IOP fellow. She's right over here on your left. Valerie is indeed the younger sister who managed his first Senate campaign and all the subsequent ones. She's become one of the nation's leading political strategists, working with many candidates. But she remembers this man as a kid. She describes someone who was a terrible stutterer, and he was small and scrappy, yet he always ended up being the leader of the pack because he made people believe in themselves. And what he hated most was bullies. That too came from his family. He once complained to his mother that kids were making fun of him because a girl who had a crush on him was sitting close to him on the bus. His mother said, "If a girl is sitting next to you, you be kind. Go after your enemies." And as Valerie put it, he could be a fierce Irish warrior. Those early values show throughout his career. As a member and ultimately chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he was a visible and sometimes controversial figure in the confirmation hearings of Robert Bork and Clarence Thomas. He championed major crime, gun, and justice legislation, including the Violence Against Women Act, the assault weapons ban. He was equally energetic in foreign policy. As a longtime member of the Foreign Relations Committee, he quickly became known as a knowledgeable, nuanced, and forceful voice. Biden played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. foreign policy, from Bosnia to Afghanistan, both Iraq wars, to the fight on terrorism, to START treaties and beyond. He was deeply engaged and never shy about taking a stand or openly changing his mind when new information came in. One other element was plain throughout his career: his willingness and ability to work in a bipartisan fashion. With Biden, disagreements were almost never personal, motives rarely questioned. He often worked with Republicans like Dick Lugar or Bob Dole, Jesse Helms, to craft strategy and legislation. In 2009, Mr. Biden became 47th Vice President of the United States. John Adams once said, "The vice presidency is the most insignificant office that ever invented," this is Mr. Adams, "that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." And many subsequent holders of the office would disagree. Joe Biden has proved to be indispensable. On domestic and foreign policy, President Obama has turned to Biden for advice and leadership. The Vice President tasked him with implementing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the absolutely huge undertaking designed to aid in this nation's recovery from the terrible economic downturn in 2008. Particularly on issues where difficult partisan divisions threatened to damage the nation, time and again, Biden was essential. When the nation faced default and budget crisis, Biden was typically at the center of the efforts to craft an acceptable compromise across the parties. He was also deeply involved in policies guiding the efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. He helped secure the Senate's approval of the New START arms treaty with Russia and significant funding to maintain our nuclear laboratories. He's represented our country in every region of the world. He's traveled to more than 24 countries. And yet, through it all, Vice President Biden never seems to lose his close connection to his plain-spoken, scrappy, blue-collar roots and his capacity to connect with people across the spectrum. He calls them as he sees them, and once in a while that causes problem, but all of that is part of his appeal. The neighborhood kid who hates bullies. There are plenty who disagree with him, but few dislike him. Perhaps John McCain offered the clearest assessment of Vice President Biden. Joe Biden doesn't have a mean bone in his body. He was unique from the day he was elected before he was 30 years old. He's unique in that he's had some role in every major national security crisis this nation has faced in the last 30 years. I don't know anyone like him in the U.S. Senate. Look at the number of times he's been able to conclude agreements. I would say he's been the most impactful vice president I've known, certainly in modern times. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Vice President Joe Biden.
Thank you very much. Great to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Dean, you did that introduction exactly like my sister wrote it, it sounds like. Thank you. That was very, very generous of you. And as we used to say in the Senate, please excuse a point of personal privilege. There are 3 reasons why I've won the races I've won and why I've sustained winning. And they're right here in this front row. The first was my sister, but also the guy who got me through the 1972 campaign is one of the best political strategists I've ever known, and a man who is, as Frank, is that you, Frank, back there? Frank Fahrenkopf, the former chairman of the Republican Party. We know each other a long time, back to the days when we really liked one another, Republicans and Democrats. We still do. It's great to see you, Frank. But as Frank can tell you, and anyone else can tell you, that the one thing when you hire a political consultant that you most are concerned about, and I mean this sincerely, is will they reflect your values? This guy that I'm about to introduce to you has more integrity in his little finger than most people have in their whole body, but there's a reason I overcame that deficit. John Martilla, a native Bostonian here. And the guy sitting next to him, who was fought in Vietnam and came back to fight against the war in Vietnam, and has become my friend. And if you ever have that old joke, if you have to be in a foxhole, this is the guy you want with it, Professor Tommy Valerie. Tommy, it's great to see you. I didn't expect to see you. And it's great to be here. And I have one plea: don't jump. Don't jump. It's good to be back. I understand that Senator Markey may be here. I hope for his sake he's not, and he's out campaigning, but I was told he might be. and Congressman Delahunt, two fine friends. If they're here, I want to acknowledge them. Folks, all's changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. Those are the words written by an Irish poet, William Butler Yeats, about the Easter Rising in 1916 in Ireland. They were meant to describe the status of the circumstance in Ireland at that time. But I would argue that in recent years, they better describe the world as we see it today, because all has changed. The world has changed. There's been an incredible diffusion of power within states and among states that has led to greater instability. Emerging economies like India and China have grown stronger, and they seek a greater force in the global order and global affairs. Other powers like Russia are using new asymmetrical forms of coercion to seek advantage, like corruption and, quote, little green men, foreign agents, soldiers with a mission but no official uniform. New barriers and practices are challenging the principles of an open, fair economic competition. And in a globalized world, threats as diverse as terrorism and pandemic disease cross borders at blinding speeds. The sheer rapidity and magnitude, the interconnectedness of the major global challenges demand a response, a different response, a global response, involving more players, more diverse players than ever before. This has all led to a number of immediate crises that demand our attention, from ISIL to Ebola to Ukraine, just to name a few that are on our front door. As someone said to me earlier this week, the wolves closest to the door. Each one in its own way is symptomatic of the fundamental changes that are taking place in the world. These changes have also led to larger challenges. The international order that we painstakingly built after World War II and defended over the past several decades is literally fraying at the seams right now. The project of this administration, our administration, at this moment in the 21st century, the project that President Obama spoke about last week at the United Nations, is to update that order, to deal with these new realities, but also accommodate and continue to reflect our enduring interests and our enduring values. And we're doing this in a number of ways. First, by strengthening our core alliances. Second, building relationships with emerging powers. Third, defending and extending the international rules of the road that are most vital. And fourthly, confronting the causes of violent extremism. But all of this rests on building a strong, vibrant economy here at home to be able to underpin our ability to do anything abroad. So tonight, I want to talk to you about our efforts and provide as best I can an honest accounting of what it's going to take for America to succeed in the beginning of the 21st century. The first thing we have to do is to further strengthen our alliances. Many of the challenges we face today require a collective response. That's why we start from a foundation of the strong alliance we've had historically in Europe and in Asia, a feature of American strength unmatched by any other nation in history, and built on a sacred commitment to defend one another, but also built on shared political and economic values. One of the cornerstones of our foreign policy is the vision we share with our NATO allies of a Europe whole and free, where every nation can choose the path it wishes with no interference. But that vision has been recently challenged. We've seen aggression on Europe's frontier. And that's why we've moved to mobilize our NATO allies to step up and provide significant security assistance to Ukraine. Each of the 28 NATO allies has now committed to providing security assistance to Ukraine, including over $115 million from the United States. And as we respond to the crisis in Ukraine, we are determined that NATO itself emerge stronger from the crisis thrust on us by Russia. With our allies, we are increasing deployments on land, sea, and in the skies over Central and Eastern Europe. At the most recent NATO summit in Wales, the alliance agreed to create a rapid response force to make sure that NATO is ready and can respond to any contingency. And we're increasing exercises and capacity building with non-NATO nations, countries in Europe, in Europe's eastern frontier, to ensure that they too can exercise their right to choose their own future and that NATO's door remains open. But beyond mutual defense, we're working closely with Europe on everything from trade to counterterrorism to climate change. But we have to be honest about this and look it squarely in the eye. The transatlantic relationship does not sustain itself by itself. It cannot be sustained by America alone. It requires investment and sacrifice on both sides of the Atlantic. And that means ensuring that every NATO country meets its commitment to devote 2% of its GDP to defense, establishing once and for all a European energy strategy so that Russia can no longer use its natural resources to hold its neighbors hostage, reaching a final agreement on the so-called transatlantic trade and investment partnership, the new mechanism to try to strengthen the economic engines to sustain our mutual efforts in Europe and at home. To the east, for 6 decades, America's alliances in Asia have made possible the security and stability that has flowed from, that has allowed the economic miracle. When I met not long ago, and I've met many, many hours with President Xi, I probably had dinner alone with him over 22, 23 hours over 2 5-day periods. Talking about, I mentioned that I made clear that America is a Pacific power, and we will remain a Pacific power. And us in the area is the reason for the existence of the stability in Asia for the past 50 years. That's why it's essential that we modernize our Pacific alliances, updating our posture and expanding our partnerships to meet the new challenges we face. America today has more peacetime military engagements in the Asia-Pacific than ever before. By 2020, 60% of our naval assets and 60% of our air power will be stationed in the Pacific. We're supporting Japan's efforts to interpret its constitution to allow it to play a larger security role. We've signed enhanced defense cooperation agreements with the Philippines. We're strengthening our missile defense capabilities in the region to deter and defend against North Korea. And 3 years ago, we had no forces in Australia. Today, we have more than 1,000 Marines rotationally deployed in Darwin. And we have a growing partnership with Vietnam, in no small part, by the way, to the work of Tommy Valerie and his colleagues. Actively engaged in regional organizations like ASEAN. We have an historic opportunity as well to build a new relationship with Burma if we get lucky. But our Asian allies also have tough choices to make. We cannot do this on our own. It will relate to their willingness to work closely and more closely with one another. As the President and I have done in meetings with the leaders of Japan and South Korea, we're going to continue to promote trilateral cooperation among our allies and partners in the Pacific to make the most of those ties that will benefit the entire region if we succeed. In the Middle East, our alliances are also crucial. We will never waver from our steadfast support for Israel. And we're working alongside a coalition of Arab partners and countries from around the world to confront ISIL. So even as we strengthen our traditional alliances, we're building wider coalitions to bolster the world's ability to respond to these emerging crises. Take Ebola, a horrific disease that is now a genuine global health emergency. Our Center for Disease Control, USAID, and our military have taken charge of the world epidemic. We are organizing the international response to this largest epidemic in history. The President rallied the world of the United Nations last week, mobilizing countries from all around the world to act quickly. We're deploying over 3,000 American soldiers to West Africa to support regional civilian responses and advance the and advance the effort in fighting the disease of Ebola. The second thing we have to do, besides strengthening our alliances and cooperation, we have to effectively manage our relationships with the emerging powers of the 21st century. And that means putting the effort and putting in the effort to realize the potential of America's friendship with emerging democratic partners like Brazil, President Dilma, President Peña Nieto in Mexico, Prime Minister Modi in India, who just made a historic visit to the United States this week. Each of these relationships has a significant potential to genuinely promote shared interest and shared ideals. But each one has to overcome domestic politics, bureaucratic inertia, and a significant legacy of mistrust over the last century. But there's great potential here, but there's no guarantees. There is no substitute for direct engagement and an unstinting effort to bridge the gap between where we are today and where we can and should be tomorrow. The world in which emerging powers are responsible stakeholders promoting common security and prosperity has yet to arrive, but it's within our grasp to see that happen. That's why we've embraced the G20 as a model for economic cooperation. That's why it's also important that we fully support international institutions like the IMF, fund them, and reform and modernize them to better serve all nations. But managing our relationships with China is the single most essential part of the strategy at which we must succeed. Even as we acknowledge that we will often be in competition, we seek deeper cooperation with China, not conflict. Nowhere is it written that there must be conflict between the United States and China. There are no obvious impediments to building that relationship. And we're committed to building up that partnership where we can, but to push back where we must. The President plans to visit China this fall as part of his second trip to Asia this year. This is the kind of engagement that is necessary for us to come together and do consequential things. At Sunnylands, when he met with President Xi last, they reached an historic agreement on the super pollutant known as HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. And our hope is that this year we can continue to expand our cooperation with China on the climate and environment, but also be very direct about our differences. That's why in a 5-hour meeting I had with President Xi this past December, after they had several days earlier announced unilaterally an air defense identification zone, contrary to international law, I sat with President Xi and I told him bluntly, Mr. President, understand one thing. We do not recognize it, we do not honor it, and we're flying a B-52 through it. Understand. No, I'm serious. Not asking you to do anything. I'm not asking you to renege. Just understand. We will pay no attention whatsoever to it. It's important. It's important that in emerging relationships, there be absolute, frank, direct discussions. That's why we've made clear as well that freedom of navigation must be maintained in the South China Sea. But that's also why President Obama has been direct in public and private with China's leaders on cyber theft. And as the world watches Hong Kong's young people take to the streets peacefully to demand respect for their own rights, we'll also never stop standing up for the principles we believe in that are universal: democratic freedoms and human rights. President Xi asked me, why do we focus on human rights so much? I'm serious. And I gave him a direct answer, which is almost unique to the United States. Doesn't make us better or worse, but unique to the United States. I said, Mr. President, even if a president of the United States did not want to raise human rights abuses with you, to have a better relationship on the surface, it'd be impossible for him or her to do that. For the vast majority of the American people came here to seek human rights and freedom. It is stamped into our DNA. It is impossible for us to remain silent. Again, he took it on board, and it's important to understand why we do it. It is not a political tool. It is who we are. To build these robust relationships with emerging powers, we also have to demonstrate staying power, which is hard and costly, in places that will do the most to shape the world that our grandchildren are going to inherit. That's why our rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region depends in no small part on completing a trade initiative known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's the whole Pacific, from Peru all the way to China, to Japan. It's a partnership that will stitch together the economies of 12 Pacific nations, stretching from South America to Asia, united behind rising standards regarding labor, the environment, and fair competition. Once completed, these trade agreements we are negotiating across the Atlantic and the Pacific will encompass nearly 2/3 of the global trade in the world and can shape the character of the entire economic global economy. The Trans-Pacific Partnership also has a profound strategic, not economic, strategic element to it. Because deeper economic ties cement our partnerships, but most of all, help small nations resist the blackmail and coercion of larger powers using new asymmetric weapons to try to achieve their ends in other countries. And this brings me to the Western Hemisphere, a vital part of the Pacific equation, but where there's another great opportunity. The President asked me to oversee our hemispheric relations. And for the first time in history, you can truly envision a Western Hemisphere that is secure, democratic, and middle class, from northern Canada to southern Chile, and everywhere in between. But we have to overcome centuries of distrust. We can no longer look at the region in terms of what we can do for it. The question is, what can we do together in this hemisphere? And the possibilities are endless. On energy, North America is literally, not figuratively, the epicenter of energy in the world today. There are more rigs, gas and oil rigs in the United States pumping today than every other nation in the world combined. North America will account, meaning Mexico, China, and Canada, for 2/3 of the growth of global energy supply over the next 20 years. By 2018, the United States will be a net exporter of natural gas. And most projections show North America will be totally energy independent by 2020, and the United States shortly thereafter. Look at the hemisphere in terms of trade. 40% of all our exports stay in this hemisphere. 40%. We have $1.3 trillion in trade on a yearly basis just in North America, including $1.3 billion per day with Mexico alone. On security, we partnered with Colombia and Mexico and others to combat the scourge of drug trafficking. We're helping Central American countries address the root causes of poverty and violence and migration. But to realize the potential of our partnerships in the region, we have to be present. We have to build that trust. Which is why I've made 5 trips to Latin America into South America as well, just in the last 18 months. It's why we have to pass immigration reform and here in the United States. It's one thing to say we respect the rest of the Americas, the majority of which are Hispanic. And there's another thing to say we respect them and yet not respect the immigrant population that's Hispanic here in the United States. It does not connect. The single most significant thing we can do to fundamentally change the relationship in terms of trust and commitment is to pass immigration reform. Those of you who travel to or are from Central and South America know of what I speak. Because respecting immigrants from the Americas is part of how we show that we really have changed our view that South and Central America is no longer our backyard, it is our front yard. It is our partner. The relationship is changing, and when it changes fully, the benefits for us are astounding. The third thing we need to do, and are doing, is to defend and extend the international rules of the road and deal with asymmetrical threats that are emerging. The international system today is under strain from actors pushing and sometimes pushing past the limits of long-standing important international norms like non-proliferation and territorial integrity. That's why we insisted that Syria remove its chemical weapons stockpile and the means to manufacture them. So we assembled, under great criticism, a coalition with Russia and others to remove Syria's chemical stockpile. That's why we had to make it clear to Iran that we will not allow them to acquire a nuclear weapon. So we put together the single most effective international sanctions in history to isolate Iran and to push them back to the negotiating table. Elsewhere, actors are subverting the fundamental principle of territorial integrity through the use of new asymmetric tactics, the use of proxies to quietly test the limits and probe the weaknesses across boundaries and borders, on land and sea, the use of corruption as a foreign policy tool, unlike any time in modern history, to manipulate outcomes in other countries in order to undermine the integrity of their governmental institutions. That's exactly what's happening in Ukraine today. President Putin, was determined to deny Ukraine and the Ukrainian people the power to make their choices about the future, whether to look east or west or both. Under the pretext of protecting Russian-speaking populations, he not only encouraged and supported separatists in Ukraine, but he armed them. He sent in Russian personnel out of uniform to take on the Ukrainian military, those little green men. And when that wasn't enough, he had the audacity to send Russian troops and tanks and sophisticated air defense systems across the border. But we rallied the world to check its ambitions and defend Ukrainian sovereignty. We didn't put boots on the ground. Putin sought to prevent a free and open election. We rallied the world to help Ukraine hold, quite possibly, the freest election in its history. Putin sought to destabilize Ukraine's economy. We provided $1 billion directly from the United States and worked with the IMF on a $27 billion international rescue package to keep them from going under. Putin sought to keep Ukraine weak through corruption. We're helping those leaders fight back corruption, which, by the way, is an issue that that demands our leadership around the world, by helping them write new laws, set up a new judiciary, and much more. Putin sought to hollow out Ukraine's military over the last 10 years, and he was very successful. But we rallied NATO and NATO countries to begin to build that military capability back up. Putin sought to keep secret Russian support for separatists who shot down a civilian airliner. We exposed it to the world and in turn rallied the world. And remember, this all began because Putin sought to block Ukrainians' accession agreement with the European Union. Well, guess what? That agreement was signed and ratified several weeks ago. Throughout, we've given Putin a simple choice: respect Ukraine's sovereignty or face increasing consequences. That has allowed us to rally the world's major developed countries to impose real cost on Russia. It is true they did not want to do that. But again, it was America's leadership and the President of the United States insisting, oftentimes almost having to embarrass Europe to stand up and take economic hits to impose cost. And the results have been massive capital flight from Russia, a virtual freeze on foreign direct investment, a ruble at an all-time low against the dollar, and Russian economy teetering on the brink of recession. We don't want Russia to collapse. We want Russia to succeed. But Putin has to make a choice. These asymmetrical advances on another country cannot be tolerated. The international system will collapse if they are. And to state the obvious, it's not over yet. There are no guarantees of success, but unlike the Ukrainian people have stood up, and we are helping them, leading and acting strategically. The fourth element of our strategy is countering violent extremism. As you know, we've engaged in a relentless campaign against terrorists in Afghanistan, in the so-called Fatah, in Pakistan, Somalia, and elsewhere. This campaign against violent extremism predates our administration, and it will outlive our administration. But we made real progress against al-Qaeda's core and its affiliates since 9/11. But this threat of violent extremism is something we're going to have to contend with for a long time. Today, we're confronting the latest iteration of that danger, so-called ISIL, a group that combines al-Qaeda's ideology with territorial ambitions in Iraq and Syria and beyond, and the most blatant use of terrorist tactics the world has seen in a long, long time. But we know how to deal with them. Our comprehensive strategy to degrade and eventually defeat ISIL reflects the lessons we have learned post-9/11 age about how to use our power wisely. And degrading them does not depend on an unsustainable deployment of hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground. It's focused on building a coalition with concrete contributions from countries in the region. It recognizes outside military intervention alone will not be enough. Ultimately, societies have to solve their own problems, which is why we're pouring so much time and effort into supporting the Syrian opposition and Iraqi efforts to reestablish their democracy and defend their territory. But this is going to require a lot of time and patience. The truth is, we will likely be dealing with these challenges of social upheaval, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the Middle East in the wake of the Arab Spring, which will take a generation or more to work itself out. We can't solve each of these problems alone. We can't solve them ourselves. But ultimately, and we can't ultimately solve them with force, nor should we try. But we can work to resolve these conflicts. We can seek to empower the forces of moderation and pluralism and inclusive economic growth. We can work with our partners to delegitimize ISIL in the Islamic world and their perverse ideology. We can cut off the flow of terrorist finance and foreign fighters, as the President chaired the hearing in the United Nations Security Council on that issue just last week. We can build the capacity of our partners from the Arab world to Afghanistan to solve their security problems in their own countries with our help and guidance. The threat posed by violent extremists is real. What I want to say here on the campus of Harvard University, our response must be deadly serious, but we should keep this in perspective. The United States today faces threats that require attention, but we face no existential threat to our way of life or our security. Let me say it again. We face no existential threat, none to our way of life or our ultimate security. You are twice as likely to be struck by lightning as you are to be affected by a terrorist event in the United States. And while we face an adaptive, resilient enemy, let's never forget that they're no match for an even more resilient and adaptive group of people, the American people, who are so much tougher, smarter, realistic, and gutsy than their political leadership gives them credit for. We didn't crumble after 9/11. We didn't falter after the Boston Marathon. But we're America. Americans will never, ever stand down. We endure. We overcome. We own the finish line. So do not take out of proportion this threat to us. None of you are being taught to dive under your desks in drills dealing with the possibility of a nuclear attack. And I argue with all of my colleagues, including the administration, the American people have already factored in the possibility there will be another Boston Marathon someday. But it will not, cannot, has no possibility of breaking our will, our resolve, and or our ultimate security. Which brings me to the fifth and final point, the strength of America's economy. Without a strong economic foundation, none of which I have spoken to is possible. None of it. It all rests on America remaining the most vibrant and vital economy in the world. And America is back. America remains the world's leading economy. I got elected when I was 29 years old, it was pointed out. I was referred to in those days as a young idealist. And I'm today, if you read about me, among the many things that are often said, good and bad, I'm always referred to as the White House optimist. As if somehow, as my grandpa would say, I fell off the turnip truck yesterday. I'm optimistic because I know the history of the journey of this country. And I have never been more optimistic about America's future than I am today, and that is not hyperbole. We are better positioned than any other nation in the world to remain the leading economy in the world in the 21st century. We have the world's greatest research university. We have the greatest energy resources in the world. We have the most flexible venture capitalist system, the most productive workers in the world. That's an objective assertion. We have a legal system that adjudicates claims fairly, protects intellectual property. Don't take my word for it. A.T. Kearney has been doing a survey for over the last, I believe, 30-some years. They survey the 500 largest industrial outfits in the world. They ask the same question. Where's the best place in the world to invest? This year, America not only remains the best place in the world to invest by a margin larger than any time in the record of the survey. The Boston Consulting Group right here, a first-rate outfit, surveys every year American corporations with manufacturing facilities in China and asks them what are they planning for next year. This year, the response was 54% of those invested in China said they plan on coming home. I don't know how long I've been hearing about how China, and I want China to succeed. It's in our interest they succeed economically. But how China is eating America's lunch. Folks, China has overwhelming problems. China not only has an energy problem, they have no water. No, not a joke, like California, they have no water. It is a gigantic and multi-trillion-dollar problem for them. We should help them solve the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, raise your hand if you think our main competition is going to come from the EU in the next decade. Put your hands up. I'm not being facetious here now. I'm being deadly earnest. It is overwhelming our interest that the EU grow and that China grows, because when they don't grow, we don't grow as fast. But ladies and gentlemen, in relative terms, we are so well positioned if we act rationally, if we invest in our people. Recent study points out that American workers are 3 times as productive as workers in China. It matters in terms of where people will invest their money, where jobs will be created. And I was in and out of Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina over 20-some times. As Maggie remember, I was the voice that kept hectoring President Clinton to lift the arms embargo and take on Milosevic, which he did to his great credit. And on one of my trips to Kosovo, I had a Kosovar driver, meaning he was Muslim, a Kosovar driver, and who spoke a little English. And I was going up to Fort Bonsteel, which was being right outside of Pristina, a fort that was being built on a plateau. And it was a rutted, muddy road. And the tires were spinning to get up there. But there were all these cranes and bulldozers and all this incredible movement. And my driver very proudly sort of looked down like this and looked out when he pointed at me, he said, "Senator, America, America." And we were literally at a gate. And Tommy, you know the old pike that came down across this rutted road, red and white striped. And standing to the right of the gate, stopping us, were 5 American soldiers. An African-American woman who was a master sergeant, a Chinese-American, I forget the rank, an African-American man, a woman colonel, and a Hispanic commanding officer. And I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "No, no." And I meant it sincerely. I said, "There's America. There's America. And so you figure out how to live together like we do, you will never, never, never make it." America's strength ultimately lies in its people. There's nothing special about being American. None of you can define for me what an American is. Can't define it based on religion, ethnicity, race, culture. The uniqueness of America is that we are a group of people who have agreed on, whether we say it, whether we're well educated or not, whether we say it in terms of basic agreements, but we really do believe, without saying it, we the people, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. Sounds corny, but that's who we are. That's the essential strength and vibrancy of this country. And that's why it's our obligation to lead. It's costly. It takes sacrifice. And sometimes it's dangerous. But we must lead. But lead in a more rational way, as I hope I've outlined for you. Because we can deal with the present crises. And it is within our power. It's within our power to make a better world. You're a lucky group of students. I'm not being solicitous. You're lucky because you are about to take control at a time when one of those rare inflection points in the history of the world, in this country. Remember from your physics class in high school, if you didn't have to take it in college? I remember my physics professor saying, an inflection point is when you're riding down the highway at 60 miles an hour, your hand's on the steering wheel, and you turn it abruptly 2, 5, 10 degrees one way or the other, and you can never get back on the path you were on. We are at an inflection point. The world is changing whether we like it or not. But we have our hands on the wheel the only time you get a chance to bend history a little bit for these moments of great change. If we're wise, if we have courage and resolve, and with a little bit of luck, we can all make the world a better place, for real. God bless you all. May God protect our troops. Thank you.
Good. So we have time for just a few questions. The Vice President's schedule is very tight, as you can imagine. But we have microphones on 4 locations, right here, here, and here. So I just want to remind you what a good question consists of here at the Kennedy School. Please identify yourself. Keep it short with one thought, and it ends with a question mark. So we'll start right over here.
Yes. Hi, Mr. Vice President. My name is Will. I'm a junior at the college. My question is, in retrospect, do you believe that the United States should have acted earlier in Syria, and if not, why is now the right moment?
No. Maybe I can ask that to help.
It's working.
I'll turn this one on, but I'll use this in the meantime. Is this working? There we go. Okay. The answer is no for 2 reasons. One, the idea of identifying a moderate middle has been a chase America has been engaged in for a long time. We Americans think in every country in transition, there's a Thomas Jefferson hiding beside some rock or a James Madison beyond one sand dune. The fact of the matter is the ability to identify a moderate middle in Syria there was no moderate middle, because the moderate middle are made up of shopkeepers, not soldiers. They're made up of people who, in fact, were ordinary elements of the middle class of that country. And what happened was, and their history will record this, because I'm finding that former administration officials, as soon as they leave, write books, which I think is inappropriate. But at any rate, no, I'm serious. I do think it's inappropriate. At least, give the guy a chance to get out of office. What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened? Now all of a sudden, I don't want to be too facetious, but they have seen the Lord. Now the president's been able to put together a coalition of our Sunni neighbors, because America can't once again go in to a Muslim nation and be the aggressor. It has to be led by Sunnis to go and attack a Sunni organization. And so what do we have for the first time? Now Saudi Arabia has stopped the funding going in. Saudi Arabia is allowing training on its soil of American forces under Title X open training. The Qataris have cut off their support for the most extreme elements of the terrorist organizations. And the Turks, President Erdogan told me, he's an old friend, said, "You were right. We let too many people through. Now they're trying to seal their border." So this idea that somehow it was within our power early on in this process, and there were a couple former members of the administration who were arguing we should give, quote, the opposition, which we couldn't identify as moderate, by the way, I'm serious about that, give them ground-to-air launch missiles. Can you imagine what would have happened if that had been done? Does anybody doubt they would have been in the hands of al-Nusra or al-Qaeda or Khorasan Group or ISIL? There's a difference between, it's good to be both tough and smart. They're a pair that's required. So now what's happened is everyone in the region has awakened. And now under U.S. leadership, the coalition has been put together, and they're moving. You notice what Turkey did today. What Erdogan told me last Thursday he would do. Asked me not to say anything until it was voted on. They voted in the Turkish parliament to allow Turkish ground forces in to take on ISIL. Turkish airspace be able to be used by NATO and by other allies. Turkish airspace be able to accommodate our drones. So this idea that there was an option there is fiction. It did not exist. We could have poured, if we could find every moderate we could find, and by the way, now it's public, we have been training moderate forces. But we've been very select in making sure who they were and vetting them. And now the number is classified, but there are more than several thousand in country now, and there will be more. But it's absolute fiction to suggest that early on, if we had just acted more quickly. It took Saudi Arabia to figure out ISIL's objective wasn't Ramadi, it was Mecca and Medina. It took a while for the Iranians to realize the existential threat to Iran was a radical Sunni extremist terrorist group. It took a while for Turkey, a Sunni nation, to figure out that ISIL was a direct, immediate threat to their well-being. It took a little while for Russia to figure out that all those Chechens that are making their way to eastern Syria, going back to Chechnya, is not a good thing. So now we have a coalition. But it's still going to be a hell of a long fight. A hell of a long fight. But it cannot be, even if we wanted to, it cannot be our fight alone. This cannot be turned into a U.S. ground war against another Arab nation in the Middle East. Hope that answers the question.
Next question.
I can do yes or no. I can do some more. No, I can do some more. Go, whoever you say.
Next
Dean.
one right up here.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My name is Max Leviskin. I'm a sophomore at the college. You spoke a lot about human rights in your speech, and so I want to ask you a little bit more about that.
Sure.
So I think essentially your argument was that human rights is really at the core of American foreign policy, and that we're unique in that sense. But currently in our strikes against ISIS, we're working with Saudi Arabia. I think 8 people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia in August. We're working with Qatar, a country that to some extent more or less allows slave labor. And so I think that when you look at the full breadth of the evidence, to say that we're really consistently influenced by human rights isn't necessarily supported. And so my question for you is twofold. How do you think that human rights does influence U.S. policy, and how do you think that it should?
I think human rights influence U.S. policy in us making it known whether we're working with a country that's in our interest or against our interest, what the limits are that we believe are proper conduct. We have made it clear to the Saudis we do not at all condone their beheadings. We made it clear to them that we do not agree with the way they proceed. We don't agree with the way they treat women. I could go on and on and on. But it's a little bit like, and I know you don't mean this, I'm being a little facetious. You know, all generalizations are false, including this one I'm about to make. It's a little bit like saying, you know, we should have never cooperated with Stalin to defeat the Nazis. We knew Stalin was a no-good SOB from the very beginning. No, for real. I mean, we did. There was no illusions. Millions of Russians had been killed. We knew. But there's a thing called self-interest. And it is overwhelming the interest of everyone, including the Saudis, and maybe alter their behavior ultimately, if we in fact eliminate and or do great damage to this perverse group called ISIL that is giving, and part of the thing we're doing now with ISIL, it's not merely using air power and organizing military alliances. What we're doing is we're spending an incredible amount of time and talking to our Saudi friends, quote unquote, and our Turkish friends and others, to delegitimize ISIL as a religious-based organization. And that's why for the first time there's over 120 imams of major denominations across the world that are condemning ISIL, taking away their legitimacy to respond and act in the region by pointing out that they're perverting Islam. So part of this is to discredit this organization. There's other things we're doing as well. But my generic point is that you are hardly ever in a circumstance where there is something that you choose an ally in an area that shares every one of your values. But that does not mean we remain silent with Saudi Arabia. We have not remained silent with Saudi Arabia. And I certainly haven't remained silent with Saudi Arabia. You were very polite introducing me, but sometimes I say controversial things. I think Frank may admit to this. I don't think anyone ever doubt I mean what I say. The problem is I sometimes say all that I mean. And I got to make sure not to do that right now. Anyway, it's a good question, kiddo, and it's legitimate. It's legitimate. But I would argue it's not inconsistent to look out for your self-interest while as long as you at the same time are making clear to the ally at the moment that you, in fact, do not agree with what we perceive to be their violation of human rights.
Next question right up here.
Hey.
Hi, Mr. Vice President. My name is Asaramo Okolo. I'm a sophomore at the college. I'm also membership director of the Harvard College Democrats. On behalf of the Dems across
The answer's
campus, yes. We want to welcome you and say that we love you a lot.
Well, that's very nice.
But as young Democrats, we understand the urgency and importance of a strong and firm foreign policy plan. But as we prepare to take the reins of leadership, we also see Ferguson, we see the crumbling immigration system that you mentioned, and we see Congress that really hasn't worked for many years. And so instead of asking you one more time what your plan is, we want to know what your advice is for us, your Democrats, as we step forward.
I think it's a really good question. I just spent an hour in my sister's class with her students speaking to that very question. So I'll try to summarize this in 3 minutes. Number one, the situation in Ferguson is terrible, but the progress we've made is overwhelming in the United States of America. It pales in comparison to anything. It doesn't mean what happened is not as vile as what happened in my generation in the civil rights movement, which I come out of, but it is a fundamentally different world. And so what we have to do is we have to keep making the case for transparency, keep holding people accountable when they violate the rights of other individuals. And we have to continue to make the case that for civil rights and civil liberties in this country. But we are so far beyond where you would have been apoplectic in my generation. With Swerner and what, anyway, so, number one, put this in perspective. The individual occurrence is horrible. Like, for example, the murder rate is down, but if your family member is murdered, it doesn't matter whether the murder rate is 0 but for that single murder. It doesn't matter. But looking at the nation as a whole, there has been overwhelming progress, and that's why we have to continue to fight. Case in point, there have been an ancillary aspect of that. 81 pieces of legislation introduced in state legislative bodies to curtail the right to vote. This fight is never over. It's like cutting grass. Oh, no, I really mean it. You cut your grass early in the summer, it looks great. Let it go for a week, it still looks good. A month gets raggy. Let it go all summer, you got a little jungle. I really mean it. You have to cut the grass constantly. Constantly, constantly, constantly. And that's where you all come in. With regard to the dysfunctional Congress, the Congress is, look, people say the United States is a divided nation. We're not a divided nation, for God's sake. And every single major issue, go back to your political science classes, look at the polling data. Every issue, from minimum wage to marriage equality to major economic issues on taxes, et cetera. Look at them all, the 9 major issues. The American people have a consensus from 53% to 74% agreeing on every one of those issues. What's changed are the political parties. I was joking with Frank, who I really respect, and he knows I do. We used to fight like hell, but we never questioned one another's motive. We questioned each other's judgment. I got there in '72, and the old segregationists were still there in the Democratic caucus. James O. Wheaton, Holman Talmadge, that whole crowd. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. I got there, and I ran as a kid out of the civil rights movement. I was no great shakes, but desegregating movie theaters engaged in the civil rights efforts. And I sat in a caucus with nine people who, by any other standard, would be called racist in the Democratic caucus. And I watched my friend, he became my dear friend, Teddy Kennedy. I'd watch him get up, and I remember bitter arguments between he and Eastland in the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Yet they'd leave the floor and have a cup of coffee together. They went after each other's judgment. They didn't go after motive. What's happening today? Frank will tell you. I bet he tells it in his classes. Today, we go after people's motives, which is absolutely corrosive. Remember I said to you, or I didn't, I said it in Valerie's class, never try to, improve on Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local. But I'm old enough now to be able to improve on it, or attempt to. I believe all politics is personal. It's personal. And when I attack your integrity, your motive, it's different than attacking your judgment, because you can overcome on a personal basis my disagreement with your judgment. But it pollutes the relationship. It poisons it when I make it personal. And you cannot, in this country, as diverse as we are, govern this country without consensus. And the one way to make sure consensus cannot be arrived at is go after your motive. I learned a very important lesson when I was a 31-year-old kid. I didn't want to go to the United States Senate after my wife and daughter were killed. And I mean that sincerely. My sister will tell you, other people can tell you, John Martilla can tell you. My brother went to the governor-elect to determine who would take my place, because I wasn't going to be sworn in. I wouldn't even go down to be sworn in. They sent a secretary of the Senate, because they were worried I'd changed my mind, up to the hospital where my sons were, and swore me in, because they were afraid, the Democrats were afraid I wouldn't keep the commitment to come for 6 months. And every week, once a week on Thursday at 3 o'clock, I'd go to see the majority leader, a man of great integrity. And any older Republicans here, Democrats, can tell you, his name was Mike Mansfield, an incredible gentleman. And he'd call me in and he'd give me an assignment once a week. And I was so stupid, I thought every freshman got an assignment. No, I really did. I was 29 years old, kid. I'm the first United States Senator I ever knew. And so it wasn't like, seriously. I'm not joking. Anyway, so what happened was I'd go in and he'd give me an assignment, but I later learned he was just taking my pulse to see how I was doing because I didn't want to be there. I wanted to get out and go home to my kids who were still hospitalized. And one day I walked in, and I'd walk in and I'd walk through the Senate floor. If you ever watch on C-SPAN, the senators come in those side double doors and walk down the aisle and vote. Well, I'd always walk in on the way to see Mansfield, his office on the other side, to get a sense when the last vote was going to be for the day, what train I could catch to go home. So I'm walking through, Maggie, and I walk in, and Jesse Helms, who got elected the same year I did, was excoriating Bob Dole, a guy named Marlowe Cook, a Republican from Kentucky, and Teddy Kennedy for their support of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it seemed vile to me. And I walked in and I sat down in front of Mansfield's desk, which I always did, and he looked at me, he talked in clipped tones, and said, "Joe, what's the problem? You look upset." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I just listened to Jesse Helms. That guy has no social redeeming value. He is..." No, I was really angry. He said, "Joe, Joe, what would you say to me if I told you that 2 years ago, Dot Helms and Jesse Helms," that's his wife, were sitting in their living room a month before Christmas, first week in December. Thank you, Dean. And there was an ad in the Raleigh Observer, and there was a picture of a young boy, 10 years old, in braces up to his hips, saying, "All I want for Christmas is to belong to a family. That's all I want." And I said, "What would you say if I told you Jesse and Dot Helms went down and adopted that young man?" I said, "Mr. Leader, I'd feel like a jerk." He said, "Well, he did." And then he said to me, "Joe, I have found it's never useful to presume you know another man's motive. Question his judgment, never his motive. I think Frank could tell you, or other Republicans here, I've never once in my career questioned another man or woman's motive. I've gone after their judgment like the hammers of hell when I've disagreed, but never their judgment. Never their judgment." There's this very important lesson. Today, all we do is attack one another's judgment. Never their motive, always their judgment. But think of how we do it today. It's put in personal terms. You're bad. You're not a Christian. You're indecent. Or whatever the devil it is. And it's corrosive on the body politic. And that's where you guys come in. You got to get involved. Because this too will change. This will change. There's nothing wrong with the American people. The system is being abused, from the filibuster to the use of gerrymandering and all the rest. But they are all soluble problems. Remember, to paraphrase Plato, the penalty good people pay for not being involved in politics is being governed by people worse than themselves. Not a joke. You have no one to blame for yourself. You all have a serious disadvantage. You are bright, you are informed, and you know better. Yes.
Thank you.
And this will, I'm afraid, have to be the last question. You can see the voice of the Vice President.
No, I'm okay. I'll do a couple more.
He's in charge.
I'm going to try to say yes or no, so make him easy so I can get to more people.
Well, I think this is a yes or no question, but let me provide some background first. My name is Ishan Desai. I'm a member of the Global Health and AIDS Coalition here at Harvard. And the United States has historically played a major role in the global AIDS fight. Your administration has, in fact, released a blueprint on achieving an AIDS-free generation, which is now very much within reach. Despite this commitment, we've seen $600 million lost from funding for PEPFAR under the Obama administration since 2011. This means that 1 million people are going to be receiving are not going to be receiving life-saving HIV drugs, and ultimately we're not going to have enough funds to finish the fight. So you did mention that the United States can and should lead, and my question is, would you support an increased commitment to PEPFAR, and in particular an increase of $600 million in funding for the next 2 fiscal years?
Yes. By the way, just gets the credit for this. We get credit, Democrats. George W. Bush. George W. Bush did this. George W. Bush, a Republican. And by the way, to show you how petty Democrats can be, there was actually, when it was passed, there was an amendment, I will not mention the Democratic senator's name, a progressive Democrat, saying that there could be no markings or no connotation anywhere where PEPFAR was distributed that had anything to suggest associated with the name of George W. Bush. Democrats can be just as petty and mean, particularly liberals, and I'm a liberal, can be as petty and mean as any Republican I know. So George Bush deserves the credit.
Right over here.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Biden. My name's Seetza Gofard. I'm a senior at the college, and I'm the vice president of the student body here.
Isn't that a bitch? I mean, excuse me. Vice President thing? Whoa. How do you feel about it now? I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm joking.
We've definitely had our
Best
struggles.
decision ever made. I'm joking. That was a joke. That was a joke.
I hope you love your job.
I do, actually.
All right.
I love my guy I work with.
My question is, so you talked a lot about how America should and needs to continue to lead on the global stage. And in many parts of the world, citizens really admire the role that America plays. But having grown up abroad, I've also seen that in many parts of the world, America still carries a, unfortunately, very negative connotation. The name America is not connected to often positive reputations. So I want to wonder, A, why do you think this is? And B, what can the government do, but also we as individual citizens do to help change that?
Well, first of all, it's important, and I know I said this 8 years ago, and people keep reminding me of the quote, but I still believe it. It's important that America lead not merely by the example of its power, but by the power of its example. So that's why from the time we've come to office, we've tried to do everything to demonstrate that, what our motives are, to try to be as transparent, and do everything from this god-awful fight we still have trying to shut down Guantanamo to the organizations and groups we fund and how we respond. And so there are a lot of historical reasons. There's a lot of historical baggage and mistakes that America has made. And so one of the things you're seeing, though, if you take a look at now, the Pew Foundation worldwide poll, America is once again the most respected nation in the world. It's changing, but it's painfully difficult to change. There's a lot to overcome in certain areas of the world, some justified and some not justified. And that's why when I laid out for you why America should lead, America cannot and should not attempt to lead alone, even if it had the capacity to do it all by itself. It's critically important that in the Middle East, that there be a Arab consensus, not the United States once again imposing the will in the minds of people, especially in an area of the world where there is such immense poverty. The same way in Asia. There's an awful lot to overcome, but it takes time, but it works pretty quickly. And so what is happening is there's still a lot to overcome. But one of the things you can do, the most important thing you can do, and a lot of you will travel around the world, is understand something very clearly. That folks in other parts of the world they're just as smart as you. They're just as good and decent as you. And stop this attitude, not you, we should stop the attitude of, what can I do for you? It's what can I do with you? We have to stop being patronizing, that somehow we have all the answers. Those of you who follow me, I've traveled 1 million miles now around the world. I've gotten to meet every world leader, I believe, since 1973, just because of the nature of my job. And, you know, it matters, you know, how we approach other nations. Because remember, there is a built-in, it's understandable, a built-in resentment for the mere fact of who we are. We could be absolutely perfect, there's a built-in resentment. We are wealthy. We are secure. We are open. We have great opportunities that other nations don't have. How many of you guys are really overjoyed with the guy who's the really good-looking guy who walks in the party and all the girls turn and look at? You go, isn't he wonderful? Come on, guys. And how many of you girls were overwhelmingly joyful for your best friend when she was named homecoming queen and you weren't? Come on, man. Look, all foreign policy is a logical extension of human nature with a lot less information to act on. That's basically what it is. And the same principles that relate to human interaction, they are critical in foreign policy as well. And people can tell whether you respect them. People can tell whether or not you mean it. And so it matters. A little bit of humility goes a long, long way. And guess what? It's warranted, the humility. Yes, ma'am. Or you want me to
I
go?
think right over here. How many
Mr.
more questions have we got here, Mr. Vice President?
Look, I don't want to trespass in your time. I'll stay another half an hour if you want me to. But I hate to. Because,
Start right over
or
here.
what I can do, if you all have to go, you guys can leave, and I can stay for the folks have questions and go in another room and answer your questions. But I hate like hell you've been waiting. I don't want to. Anyway, go
Mr.
ahead.
Vice President, it's a great honor to have you here. My name is Konstantinos Papaloukas. I come from Famagusta, Cyprus, and I'm also a vice president of the European Club at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I did raise my hand when you asked the question about European Union. My question. We all know that ISIS exports and illegally sells Iraqi oil via Turkey. And we all know that Turkey supports in many ways Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And we all know that Erdogan is as a president now, is on a clear collision course with both Israel and President Sisi's government in Egypt. In a period where Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt are entering this non-zero sum game in the Eastern Mediterranean energy map, Turkey is sending a corvette to harass an Italian ship or its navy in the Aegean to patrol the Greek islands in the Aegean, and not for holidays. And my question is, how do the United States of America evaluate Turkey's destabilizing role in the wider area of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East? And is this a potential problem for the United States in the future years? Thank you.
Yes. Look, as you may or may not know, I've been deeply involved, more than anybody left in the Congress, in the Cyprus issue my entire career. As a matter of fact, I'm facetiously referred to by my friends, all kidding aside, as Joe Bidenopoulos. You know where I come from. No, not a joke. I've been passionately engaged in this ever since the illegal occupation.
Maybe the only fill-in.
Now, but here's the deal, guys. I said the world is changing. I just came back from Cyprus. I was with Anastasiasis. I also met with Erlu, with Anastasiasis' blessing. 3 things have occurred. Number one is Turkey fully understands it's no longer in their interest. They have no interest in having troops remaining on Cyprus. None whatsoever. Number one. Number two, Erdogan has made the break with the only constituency to whom occupation mattered, and that was the military. 3, I recently went with him, and he's committed to see me in Ankara to see if we can do 2 things. 1, reach a solution, which he says he will agree to, of a bizonal, bicommunal island. And he is beginning to realize, in my view, and I will not speak for him, that there is an overwhelming self-interest for Turkey in taking advantage of the significant resources, particularly gas, that are in the Eastern Mediterranean, that could play a significant role in liberating not only Turkey, but Greece, a pipeline, Greece, from Russia's use of energy as a weapon. And so what is starting to happen is, and I just met with Astasianas, and I met with the Israelis. There is the possibility that there will be let me put it this way. Nations, when they no longer have a overwhelming interest in the maintenance of status quo, and Turkey does not have an interest in the maintenance of the status quo in Cyprus, and when new opportunities present themselves where they can benefit without looking like they have capitulated, and also Cyprus benefits significantly, things change. We have a great assistant secretary who is in Ankara now and having discussions on this very issue. Because the irony is, just as the one thing that we're going to keep the Kurds in Iraq, which is oil, it's the very thing that may be the lubricant to bring an end to a very unfair circumstances that existed since the late 70s. So the way to deal with it is not to dwell on the past and the wrong, but look at the opportunities presented to see if there's a win-win situation for everybody to get out of this. And the reason I can say that is I'm Irish. And we understand about occupation. We understand about as George Mitchell said in the Irish Accords, there were 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. I believe we'll find the 1 day of success.
Thank you. Right up here.
Hi. Thank you, Vice President. My name is Catherine, and I'm also concerned about the future of our global health commitments. Without restoring the funding cuts to PEPFAR, the program will see the lowest treatment enrollment since it began. And I was wondering if you will help us make sure that President Obama keeps his promise to AIDS patients worldwide by calling on Senators Mikulski and Reid to defend PEPFAR and restore its funding.
The answer is, look, the president is totally committed. There's been overwhelming progress made. We continue, even with the reduction in the funding, we continue to be the major effort in pushing all of the nations involved to acknowledge the extent of their problems, set up institutions internally to deal with it. But we have another little thing called Ebola, which is going to cost us billions of dollars. If everything works out fine, the estimates are there will be 100,000 deaths in Western Africa. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And while we're dealing with the pandemic disease, which has been around for a long time, AIDS, and which we've made a major commitment and major progress on, we also, given the limitations the Congress has put on the foreign aid budget overall, have to deal with other urgent, immediate crises as well. We are not backing off of, and when I said yes to the young man's answer, we tried to get the other $600 million. But what happens is, in all of the priorities that Congress has, they did not. I'll give you an example. We should be doing a heck of a lot more in Central America dealing with the plight of unaccompanied children because of the god-awful violence they live in, but we don't have the money. So we've come up with $30 million. We could use 3 times that amount of money. The whole foreign aid budget has been compit and all has been cut significantly. You hear, and he's a good man, but he's not a lone voice. You hear Rand Paul calling for the elimination of all foreign aid. So it's, it requires there to be a rational balance so that we, in fact, are able to deal with similar scourges that will attack and take advantage of the same cadre of people in countries without health care systems and systems in place. And right now, Ebola is, if we don't get it under control. So the president's given basically Hobson's choices. You're going to continue to fund AIDS. It's not like we're not funding it. Fund AIDS at the same amount we have been and what we've asked for, and not fund this worldwide effort we're leading on Ebola, or are we going to try to do both? It's a hard call, kiddo. I keep your passion. Don't let us up. Keep insisting on all of it. But I promise you, if we had the resources that Congress would give us, there would be no question of what we would be doing. It'll come back.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much. It's been just a great honor. Your staff made me do it.